Hey, what's up, y'all? Uh, Another week, another chance to read some scripture. So I missed last week with y'all, so I missed chapter 1, but here we are picking up chapter 2. Just some initial thoughts for me. It had been a good minute since I had read James, and I've kind of learned a whole bunch about the Bible just in the past year or so. And reading James after sort of digesting a lot of the stuff that I've learned about over the years was really neat, because you can see how James is not just saying things on his own or coming up with like new theology or whatever. He's saying things that are like connected to Jesus' teaching, where you're like, oh, that sounds a lot like Genesis 1 and 2, or whoa, asking for wisdom, Solomon asked for wisdom, and all these different things. So everything's lighting up in my head as I'm reading James in this stage of my life. So that's kind of neat, you know. We're a people who read the scripture for our entire lives, and even though a lot of it's rereading, right? But you know, as we reread, we're in new situations in life, or we have a new perspective or something, and then the scripture speaks in totally new and amazing ways. So there's that. That was sort of an immediate takeaway from reading James so far. Let's see, I wrote down something. So yeah, I kind of already alluded on it, but James is not giving us anything new, but he's actually riffing off of Jesus' teaching. So little tidbit, I guess. So in the book of James, there's no like linear movement, like building on a main point. It's just a bunch of little mini speeches, I guess. I need to open up my Bible app. So yeah. So the result is a series of mini speeches giving us wisdom and a punch in the gut. So I don't know about y'all when y'all read James, but one of the other main takeaways as I've been reading it is that, man, this book is challenging. So, and it's just like one point after the next. So if you've read ahead, you know, in chapter 2, there's like two main mini speeches in that chapter, but then you move on, there's more. So it's just like one after the next. Boom, you're not doing this right. Boom, you're not thinking correctly about this one thing. But again, James isn't coming up with anything new necessarily. He's actually chiming into Jesus' teaching, especially the Sermon on the Mount, which we're kind of going to highlight in my video. Okay, so yeah, chapter 2. There's two main portraits or little speeches that he gives. The first one is sort of highlighting this idea of favoritism, or giving partial treatment to certain people. I highlighted verses to talk about. Let's see. So, verse 5, listen, my dear brothers and sisters, has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised those who love him? So, for me, reading that verse, some bells are going off. Okay, so God chose poor people, or those who are poor in the eyes of the world, to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom. I think I've heard something like that before. And if you thought that, your intuition is correct, because if you turn to Matthew chapter 5, let's see, I think verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So already there's a little hint that James is plugging into something that Jesus already taught, which makes it really cool to me. I because we're reading James, but you have another portion of scripture that helps illuminate what James is saying. So when you do that, it's like, whoa, I have to read the Sermon on the Mount now. So, you read Sermon on the Mount and you start seeing the similarities between what James is saying and what Jesus said. So that's kind of neat. Let's see, verse 8 is another verse I had highlighted. If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing right. Okay, so we kind of talked a lot about this when we were covering Galatians, so I won't talk about it a whole lot. So let's see, verse 10, for whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. So we talked about in Galatians that the way to sum up the entire law is to love your neighbor as yourself. So just take any of the 10 Commandments or something. Do not murder. It's obviously not loving your neighbor if you murder. If you commit adultery, it's obviously not loving that person or their family or your family by having an adulterous relationship with someone. So you're not loving your neighbor. So I don't think it's like James is just saying something like, oh, if you break one, you break all of them, gotcha kind of thing. It's like, no, the point of the law is to love your neighbor. So if you break any particular law in the Old Testament or in the Torah, you are not loving your neighbor. So in that sense, you are breaking the whole thing because you're not loving your neighbor. It's not like a gotcha, you break one, you break all of them kind of thing. It's just like, what do the laws mean? It means to love your neighbor. Let's go ahead and skip on to the second portrait, genuine faith versus dead faith. Let's see, that starts in verse 14. So second portrait, second little mini speech, verses I highlighted. But someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. Okay, so I thought of like a coin, right? So you have a coin, on one side you have faith, one side you have deeds. You can't have one side without the other. If you have faith, you're going to do good things. And if you have deeds, there's some reason you're doing them. And if you're a follower of Jesus, because we have faith in him. Pretty simple. Not going to elaborate on that anymore because I think we've elaborated on that enough. Okay, so verse 24, you see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. All right, this immediately made me think of Martin Luther. If you are aware of him, he was kickstarted the Protestant Reformation in Germany, and he didn't have a whole lot of positive things to say about James at the time for lots of different reasons, and I'm not like bashing on him unnecessarily, but he didn't really like James, and probably one of the reasons is this verse, because if you ever heard justification by faith alone, which I totally agree with, it doesn't sound like it meshes well with that. But again, it's like coming down to what James is saying and sort of the context of what he's saying. He's actually rooting it in Jesus' own Sermon on the Mount and his teaching. And actually that was one of Martin Luther's other critiques of James, is that there's no mention of Jesus in the book, but actually we've already highlighted one moment where he's clearly riffing off of what Jesus was saying. And so let's turn to Matthew 7:21 through 27 really quick, because I think in the second portrait of talking about what genuine faith is and what dead faith is, he's actually riffing off of what Jesus said, and I'll just read that and we'll probably just be done. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell down, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So yeah, nothing new. Nothing too controversial. I mean, Jesus himself said, there's a lot of people that say they believe or say, Lord, Lord, but the one who actually does the will of the Father is the one who gets to enter the kingdom of heaven. So there you go. We can still believe in justification by faith alone, but there's also something to be said about what it means to have faith. And it means you're going to do the will of the Father. Probably could have said more, but I'll just leave it at that. Okay, yeah, so what does that mean for me? A whole lot. I mean, James is so practical, and it kind of reads like Proverbs, I guess you could say, in that it's just like, it's not too elaborate, but it just kind of spells out in plain ways just like what you should be doing. So what does it mean for me? I'll just leave that for you to decide. I mean, we all struggle with treating people, giving people partial treatment, people that we like or are like us or something like that. And then the genuine faith versus dead faith, that's a punch in the gut. So, yeah, a lot of reading James is just being willing to take the punch and be like, yeah, I'm not doing things the way I should be doing a lot of times. So yeah, just keep reading, stay encouraged. So yeah, bye everybody.